Dear Professor Hope, I'm very happy to have you on my podcast, and we're going to talk about your expertise, how you became interested in the history of Mongols, and when did you start studying Mongols and Middle Eastern kingdoms related to Mongols.
Yes, well, again, the pleasure to talk about the Mongol
Exactly.
interest in the Mongols. Sort of dates back to my undergraduate degree. I was sitting in a Russian history class, and everything, the early history, and then all of a sudden, this was my and the more I learned about them, the more I couldn't believe that I hadn't heard more about them in previous classes. It's the largest contiguous empire in history, and it's segment in most world history classes. So I was immediately interested. I mean, not only is it history, but for me, it didn't tick any of the normal boxes that you would associate with large empires. When I used to think of empires, I used to think of, the Yellow River region, Mesopotamia, these kind of traditional agrarian civilizations. And the Mongols are a nomadic people. They sort of don't have any major river systems. They don't even have a big coastline to facilitate trade or transportation. Yet they managed to build this incredible empire. And so, the more I learned about their life ways, the more I learned about their history, the more I got interested. I have a colleague here who warns his students against dangerous knowledge that you might find an idea in a classroom that it ends up becoming your obsession, and I think that was the case with me. Yeah, yeah, hooked at first sight. Yeah.
Uh, Regarding the Mongol realm, what was the transitional period and how power struggle took place after the death of Genghis Khan in 1227. When he passed away in 1227, we had the power
Mhm.
struggle and
Mhm.
how that affected the internal stability of the Mongol Empire.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the power struggle takes time to germinate. The Chinggis Khan, he's has such he's responsible for building the Mongol state. He's responsible for creating the kind of the great Mongol nation, the Yekim Mongol Ulus. Um, and of course, he's one of the most prolific conquerors in history. He is a state builder. He is a lawgiver. Uh, and so, this record of success meant that people were pretty willing to follow his direction, even in death. Um, and at the time that he died, he designated his third son, Ögedei, as his successor. Um, Ögedei was a very, very good choice because he was a natural diplomat. He was a likable character. He's the one. one of four siblings, four of Chinggis Khan's first sort of senior sons by his first wife Borte. And he's just a likable guy. He is able to conciliate, to consult, and to build consensus. And so immediately after Chinggis Khan's death, virtually everybody accepted Ögedei as being the best choice. But even if he wasn't, everybody would have listened to what Chinggis Khan had to say. But he was an excellent choice. He was respected by his brothers, and he managed the empire in this kind of consultative, collegial way. When he built armies for conquest, he got the support of his brothers, his nephews, his in-laws, his father's former commanders. He held councils to make big decisions on that affected the whole empire. So when he introduced new policies to expand the postal system, he would consult with his brothers, he would consult with his relatives to make sure that they shared the burden, to make sure that they sort of everything was done equitably. Um, Now, this worked under Ögedei, but it's the third generation of Mongol rulers who really fell out with one another. So Ögedei's son Guyuk was a very different personality. We're told by people that met him that he was very dour, very sanguine, that he was perhaps a little bit sickly in life. Um, but also we get the impression that he was quite a proud person. He argued with his cousins over leadership of the Western campaign against Eastern Europe and Russia, and this alienates a sort of a large portion of the empire. He's not universally supported as the successor to Ögedei when Ögedei died, even though he was Ögedei's eldest son. He was more of a divisive figure. But there is also a sort of a bigger question here about sort of dynastic succession in the Mongol Empire. Nowadays we probably think in most parts of the world that primogeniture is probably the most natural way to organize the succession from one ruler to another. But the Mongol Empire is ruled like a kind of a shared family property. The Khan is the first amongst equals, but he kind of manages the collective resources of the family. The people, revenues, land, animals, offices of the empire are all treated as being a kind of shared property of the family. And so the Khan oversees this, but he is really the first among equals. Now, there's nothing in this system, in an empire that is ruled collectively by a family, there is nothing to say that authority necessarily has to pass from the Khan to his elder son. It might be that the power passes to the eldest member of the family, whether this is the ruling Khan's elder son, or maybe it's an uncle, maybe it is a cousin. Um, there is this kind of open question about who should rule. Maybe the succession should be decided on the basis of competency, whether you've proved yourself on the battlefield, whether you've demonstrated that you are a good administrator. And so this question arises after Ögedei's death and certainly after Guyuk's death about who is the most competent person, who is the perhaps the best person to govern the empire. And this leads to a conflict between the different lines of Chinggis Khan's eldest sons. His eldest, the grandson of, or son of his eldest son, Jochi, decides that it is Möngke, one of Guyuk's cousins. Guyuk's children think that it's them, and so there is this kind of tension about who the best successor is. Munke ends out winning this conflict, but he does it at a heavy price. He basically seizes power in a coup, backed by some of his cousins, and he purges his relatives who'd refused to accept his leadership. And this really sort of sets the die, if you like, about sort of how future successions are decided. When Möngke dies in 1259, his succession is also contested between his two brothers, Hublé and Arik Böke. So there is always this kind of tension about the succession. A Khan can designate an heir, but it is really up to the family as to who they think the best candidate should be. You very rarely in the Mongol Empire, it's very rare to see children inherit the throne. This is something that we see in European history, quite often. Occasionally we see candidates in Persian history as well that will come to power at a very young age. In Chinese history, we see it on a couple of occasions. The Mongols generally pick the person they think is going to do the best job or who is going to serve their interests best. So there is often this tension and conflict. And it's kind of the ultimate meritocracy. The best candidate beats his rivals and will take the throne. But this is sort of where the tension comes from.
What was the Tatar policy against conquered people, and did they commit what we would call, in modern terms, war crimes and genocide towards their enemies and enemy population? Because of course we cannot judge 12th or 13th century by modern day
Mm.
standards of human rights and human liberties. How we can
Yeah,
evaluate this?
I mean, I completely agree with you. There's no point in holding the Mongols to the moral standards of the 21st century. But even with that caveat, I, I think there is little doubt that the Mongols stand out in the Middle Ages for the brutality of some of their conquests. Now, the experience of the Mongol conquest is it's not universal. There are some places that submit to the Mongols peacefully. The Uyghurs submit peacefully. There are groups of nomads in eastern Siberia that submit peacefully. Towards the end of his death, or at the end of his rule, northern China, the bits of it that have been conquered by Chinggis Khan, most of the army are not Mongols. They're sort of they're Han soldiers, Han Chinese soldiers, Khitan soldiers, Jurchen soldiers, who have all submitted to Mongol rule, and are integrated into the empire. So the Mongols don't um, they don't necessarily just impose control on everybody. They are very good at convincing people that they will be better off if they come and join in the imperial enterprise. The Karakatay Empire in Central Asia is another one that is a kind of almost bloodless conquest, because most of the Karakatay's vassals see themselves as sort of benefiting from Mongol rule, and most of them are integrated into the Mongol bureaucracy. But of course, this is not the experience of absolutely everybody. In northern China, we know that the conquest was very brutal. In the Korean Peninsula, where I am now, the conquest begins in around 1219. The first Mongol armies to enter the Korean Peninsula appear in 1219. But there are ongoing conflicts until 1260. And in most cases, the question is whether the native Koryo dynasty is paying tribute to the Khans as they should. And whenever they stop, the Mongols simply come and raid, they burn, they kill, they extort, and they enslave. It's very brutal. Possibly tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of people are enslaved in the Korean Peninsula or killed off as a result of the Mongol conquest. In Iran, the conquest is very brutal. In eastern Iran, in Khorasan, the conquest is probably more brutal than anywhere else in the old world, in Eurasia. Um, it's not so I guess one there's two ways we can look at this. On the one hand, um, one thing that I talk about with my students is we can see that the Mongols systematically exterminate populations. They go into cities. Generally, how you are treated depends on whether you submit voluntarily or not. If the population puts up a resistance, if they fight back, or if they initially refuse to accept Mongol rule, then the consequences are pretty severe. And if there are Mongol casualties in the conquest of your city, then usually this results in the extermination of the population. The Mongols go in, they take a census, they divide up the population, separating men from women, craftsmen from other populations. So soldiers are set aside, farmers, agricultural workers are sort of set aside. If you have a trade, if you're a blacksmith or if you're a craft, an artist of some kind, then you might be spared. But generally, they'll sort of go in and they'll divide up the population, and each soldier has to kill a certain number of people until the whole city is exterminated. And this is the punishment for resistance. So there is evidence, I would say, overwhelming evidence that the Mongols are very, very systematic in the way they try and exterminate populations. Perhaps the most kind of famous example of this is the city of Bamiyan in modern day Afghanistan. The Mongols go in, during the siege, one of Chinggis Khan's relatives is killed, one of his nephews is killed. And so they go in, they divide up the population, they kill them all off. Once they've killed them off, they use siege engines to batter down all of the buildings. They set fire to the city. They have horses ride over the rubble. We're even told that they put to death rodents. They kill off animals to make sure that there is absolutely nothing left of the city. So you can't, it's the Middle Ages, so we know that other armies around the world are doing pretty awful things as well. We know that when the city of Tripoli is captured by the Mamluk armies in the Levant, they pretty much destroy the city and relocate it. We know that in Europe, when local lords feud with one another, they both seek sanctuary in each other's castles and then just attack the peasantry or kind of take revenge against each other's land rather than against the lord themselves. So we know that, the Middle Ages is not a great time for human rights. But even by the standards of the time, the Mongols seem to be exceptional. The level of destruction they sort of bring with them in some cases is just unprecedented. There is a Persian historian who flees to the Sultanate of Delhi. His name is Juzjani, um, and he seems to be wrestling with this question of why the Mongols are so brutal. He talks about an episode in which a local imam from Herat is captured by Chinggis Khan, who kind of thinks that he's a bit of a novelty. He sort of keeps him around for entertainment. But this imam sort of asks Chinggis Khan after a couple of sieges, he says, know, what are you doing? Why are you killing all these people? Don't you understand that if you kill everybody, nobody is going to be left to write the story of your victories? What are you doing? Why conquer a place if you're just going to destroy it? Like this is it seems to Juzjani that this is unreasonable, that this is irrational, the amount of destruction that's caused. Genghis Khan's answer supposedly is that that this is a stupid comment, that you don't understand how big the world is. There will always be people to write my story, which I guess he has proved right in. But this, the significance of the story to me is that Juzjani just can't come to terms with how violent the Mongol conquest is. So, yeah, even by the standards of the time, the Mongols seem to be on a completely different level. Now, the Mongols themselves, please stop me if I'm going, if I'm,
No, keep talking.
talking too much, or if you
No,
want a more
not talking too
concise.
much.
Uh,
It's very interesting,
okay,
and
okay.
I'd like to hear from you your perspective regarding the level of destruction, level of killing and rape that Mongols inflicted
Mm,
upon different realms, because amongst
mm,
medieval historians we have different opinions about that. Even though Chinese,
mm, mm,
Russian, and Arab Muslim chronicles speak about the very notorious brutality of Mongols. We have three or four different sources, or many sources from three or four different geographical locations, and
mm,
they didn't coordinate that narrative amongst themselves, which proves
mm.
that the level of destruction inflicted by Mongols was very high for medieval and ancient standards.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely it is. Yeah. I mean, the Mongols themselves, and I think, there are other things at play here as well. And, it is difficult to quantify the number of people that are killed. I think that one of the things that is often been neglected by modern historians, we focus on the number of people that are killed. But there are actually I would say there is a larger population who are, you know, destruction of cities. Part of that is because the Mongols have, killed or burned The other side of that is that the people have just left because they've got news that the Mongols are coming, and they have abandoned their homes. And so, in some cases, they will move to other cities. In some cases, where they have the resources, they'll migrate much, much further afield. But we certainly know that the Mongol conquest is responsible for a kind of redistribution of population. This leads to sharing cultures, mixing languages, the spread of religions, and certainly the exchange of expertise. But displacement is kind of the other side of this, that a lot of people get moved around. The third part of that is, aside from the killing and the displacement, is enslavement as well. The Mongols take a huge number of slaves in the territories that they conquer. They sort of view themselves as ruling over people, not ruling over land, and which is actually quite practical. Land is useless unless you have people to work it. But the Mongols see themselves as ruling over people, and so if you rule people, if you control people, or if you own people, then you move them wherever you want. You do whatever you want with them, and again, where I am at the moment in Korea, there is debate as to how many people get moved around, but it's probably in the tens of thousands. That is a really significant shift, right? The same could be said with most of the places that the Mongols go to. They move people around a lot as well, whether through enslavement or whether they become vassals. This is kind of the third thing, and so you can show up to cities, and they will be vacant. Whether the people are dead or they've left or something else is a bigger question. But this probably is what's responsible for some of the sources we read, the inconsistencies in the numbers that are described, right? So, in the siege of Baghdad, the conquest of Baghdad, we have one of the earliest sources that gives us a number is the Syriac historian Bar Hebraeus, and he says that the number of people killed is in the tens of thousands. But we also have Syrian authors writing in the 14th century that tell us that the number is about 1.8 million people. Now, that's a huge difference between tens of thousands to nearly 2 million. That's a huge difference. Um, it's almost certainly it's not 1.8 million. That's an exaggeration, but it's probably not in the tens of thousands either. What's going on here is in part that populations have some have been killed, some have been moved, and some of them return as well. These people that leave, that are displaced, often they will come back. And the Mongols are responsible for the Mongol conquest is disruptive. In almost everywhere they go, it is disruptive. But there is a recovery that takes place afterwards. New populations centers are kind of take off. In the Middle East, Baghdad is initially depleted, but Tabriz rises as a new kind of center of trade, of scholarship, of administration. Baghdad itself recovers quite well. Some of the accounts that we have are quite exaggerated. In Syria, we know, or Sham, to give it its the name that it has in most of the chronicles of the time, there is this tremendous fluidity in and mobility in the population because the Mongols never actually conquer Syria or Sham. They visit it a lot, they attack it a lot, but they never manage to impose permanent control over it. But the Mamluks set up a very good sort of warning system. Along the Euphrates River, they have a series of fortifications that give them advance notice whenever a Mongol army is approaching. They have spies, they have scouts that will give them information of when the Mongols are approaching. And so frontier towns in Syria, all over Sham, in fact, get notice and they evacuate in large numbers before the Mongols show up. And so many of them travel to Egypt. The population of Cairo suddenly swells with the arrival of these refugees. And then again, most of them return back once the Mongol armies have left. And so cities like Damascus and Hems and these other places they do prove very very resilient and flexible when it comes to dealing with the Mongol conquests. But yeah, I think you're quite right. It, it is a kind of across almost every place that the Mongols attack, whether it's Korea, China, Russia, the Middle East. The consensus is that the conquests are very, very brutal, that they're very, very violent. Um, uh, I mean, it's not without reason that the Mongol conquests are taken as a sign of the apocalypse. This is a sign that people of the time see this as an extraordinary event. Yeah.
Did they have a state ideology during the period of Genghis Khan and his successors? Because often we can hear
Yes.
from some scholars that regarding the religious practice, they were fluid and tolerant, and they didn't insist on one state ideology or state religion. What's your opinion about
Yes. I think that both are true. I think that empires, by their very nature, are cosmopolitan. If we think about empires, I mean, the most traditional definition of an empire is of one group imposing control over another group, right? So large empires, historically, empires have always been very cosmopolitan. You have one group ruling over another, or a diverse subject population. This was the case with the Achaemenid Persian Empire. It is the case with the sort of the Persian Empire. Is the case with Alexander's empire. This is just it's the case with modern sort of European empires. This is the way that empires work. They are cosmopolitan, and the empires that are most successful tend to be the ones that don't try and impose their way of doing things on their subject population, because in the case of the Mongols, they become a minority in their empire very, very quickly. They become a minority during the lifetime of Genghis Khan. So the idea that they can just force everybody to think like they do, act like they do, it would be completely impractical. The way that the Mongols succeed, as I mentioned early on, is by convincing people to join them. The Mongols at the outset of Chinggis Khan's life are a small group of people between the Onon and Keralan rivers in the north of what is nowadays Outer Mongolia. The Mongolian Plateau is a diverse place where you have Mongolian speakers, you have Turkic speakers, you have um, Nestorian Christians, you have people that sort of observe a kind of animistic cult. You have people that live in forested areas of Siberia. You have people that live on the steppe. You have people that live in the Gobi Desert, each of whom practice as a different kind of mode of subsistence. You have people that sort of live near bodies of water that fish. The Mongols have to sort of adapt to this situation. And so there is this kind of built-in, I wouldn't say tolerance. Nowadays, when we say tolerance, we kind of think of this sense of mutual respect and sort of shared sense of humanity. I don't think that's what the Mongols have. I think that's kind of our 21st century way of viewing it. I think that they have a sense of they have a pragmatism about them, an understanding that there are limits to what they can achieve. Um, the basic requirement for joining the Mongol Empire and to be subject to the Mongols is that you have to pay tax, you have to contribute to their armies, you have to help the empire, you have to serve the empire, and you also have to accept the authority of the Khan. Outside of that, doesn't matter what language you speak, what your religion is, you know, you're free to do whatever you want, but you do have to accept the authority of the Khan. So there is this, as you say, sort of built-in flexibility, but perhaps not tolerance as we would understand it. But in terms of ideology, I think there are several different pillars. The Secret History of the Mongols is the one Mongolian language source that we have from the 13th century that survives. There are others, but most of them have been destroyed. The one that survives is the Secret History of the Mongols. And on the very first page, it makes reference to this idea that Chinggis Khan has been chosen by heaven, by Mönke Tengri, by eternal heaven, and this idea sort of features in a lot of sort of the diplomatic correspondence that the Mongols write with the Europeans, with various Muslim leaders and potentates. They invoke this idea of divine um, uh, mandate. Heaven has given them the right to rule over the world. This is something that most famously Chinggis Khan's grandson, the third Khan of the Mongol Empire, Guyuk, writes to the Pope, to Pope Innocent the Fourth. Pope Innocent the Fourth is sort of perturbed by the fact that the Mongols have invaded in Eastern Europe and have attacked Hungary, the Kingdom of Hungary, the biggest Catholic kingdom in Central Europe. And so he writes to Guyuk and he sort of he asks what on earth he's doing, and he tries to convince Guyuk to convert to Catholicism. And Guyuk says, you know, what are you talking about? Like, you know, what makes you think that God's on your side? Clearly, God's on our side. Heaven is on our side. Otherwise, why would he have allowed us to conquer so much? So he calls the Pope to come and um, accept his leadership, and to convert at his hands. So this idea of heaven is kind of central. The other sort of pillar of Mongol ideology, I think, which has been perhaps underestimated by a lot of historians, is this idea of the yasa, which is kind of a form of traditional law. I guess we would think in the Islamic world, the closest thing would be to the Sunnah, right? Like this idea of the tradition, the way things have always been done. Of course, in the Islamic tradition, the Sunnah is sort of based on the behavior of and the sayings of the Prophet
Yeah,
and his
I,
companions. But we know this idea of,
so is
yeah,
equally important as Quran itself, because without hadiths,
right,
without Sunnah of Prophet Muhammad, you
right,
don't have
right.
the
But
explanation
there is,
of what's in Quran, and
right,
the
right,
material is much more detailed than Quran itself.
right,
So
right.
it's very important
Absolutely.
for
But when
Muslims.
we know that, absolutely, absolutely. So the Yasa and the Yosun, the proclamations and the traditions pertaining to Chinggis Khan, the way things have always been done, is has a similar position in Mongol society as well. Uh, and Similar to in the Middle East. I mean, in the Islamic world, the idea of the Sunnah predates Islam, right? We have records of the Sunnah being invoked in Roman law. This idea of the Sunnah as being part of the kind of earlier pre-Islamic culture as well, albeit after the Prophet obviously is a kind of Islamic Sunnah, but for the Mongols, it's very similar. A lot of the Yasa are the proclamations of Chinggis Khan. The Yosun are the way of doing things. And we get a sense of this from the secret history of the Mongols. There are just certain things um, that are a sort of basic part of the way that Mongol society is organized. So we know, for example, that oaths are very important. You have to, if you say you're going to do something, you have to do it. You have to live up to your word. If
It's
you
more
break
like a tribal
your
law.
oath, then you are
I would correct you here
right,
because
right. To some extent, I mean, it's
Yasa is more
yeah,
like
yeah.
tribal law than Hadith or Sunnah of Prophet Muhammad. So it's more related to the tribal law and tribal practice because
Well,
both
I think
sides
it's
are very tribal
I
at that time.
uh, well, it depends what we mean by tribe. I mean, I would say there are sort of earlier. I mean, the Mongol Empire, it emerges out of the ashes of the Khitan Lao Empire, which dominates sort of Inner Mongolia and parts of Outer Mongolia up until the 12th century, and then there are a constellation of successor states that are often referred to as tribes, but inherit some of these earlier sort of traditions. And so, yeah, you could say these traditions certainly predate Chinggis Khan in some cases, I would say. Revenge. Feuding culture, this idea of, sort of an eye for an eye is also a part of this. If you suffer an insult or if you sort of someone offends you in some way, then you need to protect your honor. This is another side of this, and so yeah. Well, so the Yasa, um,
Let me see if it's recorded.
thinking about an imperial ideology, then we have
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. We're talking about the
yeah. So
oral
if we're
codes.
thinking about an imperial ideology,
Mhm.
right, right, yeah, yeah. So we have sort of there's eternal heaven, there is the Yasa. I guess where I'm going with that is there is this if we're thinking about decision making, when Chinggis Khan sets out to on his grand campaign of conquest, um, historians nowadays we tend to explanations for there is no obvious sign that Chinggis Khan knows the limits of what he is capable of when he sets out on his career. His decision making is informed by a lot of different things. Part of it is this idea that he is protected by heaven, definitely, but part of it is also based on this kind of moral code, as we were saying. There is this sense from past experience, this idea of an eye for an eye, living up to oaths. There is a kind of a social, political in the secret history of the Mongols that servants owe respect to their masters, that subjects owe respect to their lords, wives owe respect to their husbands, slaves need to observe, the mandates of their masters. And so this also informs his worldview, and to a certain extent, it determines his responses to certain situations. When he comes into contact with, the various Chinese dynasties that are ruling in the Yellow River region and in the Ordos region, uh, between him and these rulers and how he feels he and his family and his people have been treated, and he feels like they're not being respectful, that they are interfering in the politics of the Mongolian plateau. And so it's in these occasions that the Yosun, this traditional law, or this kind of ethic, if you like, this value system informs. Again, this is really based mainly on Chinggis Khan's proclamations. His successors are looking to imitate what he does. They try to replicate his success, and they do that by following his orders. When Chinggis Khan dies, his successor Ögedei, one of the first things he does when he is nominated as Khan is to codify Chinggis Khan's proclamations as a kind of body of law. But the secret history does say that it is written down, that Ögedei does compile it, and subsequent Khans probably add to it. But again, this informs their thinking. It means that when Ögedei inherits the throne, one of the things that he needs to do is continue all of Chinggis Khan's former policies. One of those is to go to war with northern China to finish off the wars that Chinggis Khan had started in Iran, in northern China, and even further afield in the Kipchak steppe, what is nowadays Russia. Uh, so yeah, these three components. There is the heavenly mandate, the yasa, and then the yosun. Or the other word that is given to it is the toru. The toru is a kind of this again this earlier common law tradition, or this traditional law. It isn't when I say law, it's behaviors between like ritual purity. It is all encompassing, but this does certainly play a role in their thinking about how an empire should be governed, and it regulates the way that they behave or respond to outside powers as well. I think that there is this debate, I think, among historians about when this divine mandate or imperial ideology emerges. And I think to some extent it's that, there is merit in that approach, but I think it is also a little bit misguided, because I think that a lot of these ways of thinking were already present in Chinggis Khan's early life. Some of them predate them. We know that this ideology of the divine mandate, eternal heaven is sort of derived from earlier Turkic empires. The Yosun or the it probably predates Genghis
Would you like to add something for the end
Khan as well.
of our first conversation?
Uh, sorry?
Would you like to add something for the end of our initial conversation? Because I'm planning to talk multiple times with you about your books, relations between Mongol
Hmm.
Empire
Hmm.
and Persian and other Muslim states in the Middle East, including Mamluk state, which successfully defeated Mongols during their
Hmm.
campaign in that region.
Hmm. 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 Um, what depends how where I would sort of elaborate on. I suppose that I yeah I it's a big question. We've covered some big topics from imperial ideology to conflict and so forth. Um, but yeah, I think we're entering an interesting new phase in our understanding of the way that the early Mongol Empire worked, based mainly on a reconstruction of the secret history of the Mongols. So much of the history of the Mongol by non-Mongols, by again Chinese, Arabs, Persians, Russians. Um, there has been a tendency to view the Mongol Empire as being a part of these national histories of other places, and I think that in the last 10 to 20 years there has been a shift towards trying to put them. So I of tradition have sort of come from that place. Um, this sort of hope. I hope that we're sort of able to achieve that over the next conversations that we have as well.
Of course, we're going to focus more on certain aspects of the Mongol Empire and the origin of Mongols, and of course, how they became influenced by Chinese culture. This is also another big topic because after second, third generation
Right.
of uh, of rule of China, they became heavily influenced by Chinese philosophy and Chinese art of politics and art of governing. They stopped being nomads and people who just burn and pillage. But on the other hand, they were heavily influenced by the Chinese political concepts.
I think always to an extent. Like I say, I think the purpose of an empire, if we sort of come back to this question, is to take advantage of the manpower, the technology, the resources of the people that you conquer. And I think the Mongols understand this. The Chinggisides understand this, and so again, they rely any case where the Mongols ever abandon this sense of themselves as being separate or special or being um, draw talent, and they're able to draw on that wherever they go. But yeah, and that includes from China. To say that available to us. And definitely the biggest part of the Mongol Empire in East Asia, but it is also one component in a much bigger empire that includes Mongolia, Korea, Tibet, East Turkestan groups that are inside China as well. And so I think it is possible to read Chinese sources and walk away with the sense that the Mongols become Chinese. It's also possible to read Tibetan sources and come away with the sense that the Mongols are Tibetans.
Mhm.
Um, Sort of texts that appear after in the second century. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you so much for your time, Professor Hope.
No, it was a great pleasure. Great pleasure. Always happy to talk about the Mongols.
We're going to talk more, maybe 10, 15 times.
Sounds good.
I'm warning you in advance.
All right, sounds good to me.
All the best. All the best,
Well,
and
I mean,
we'll definitely talk
oh, that sounds
more.
good.
Have a good day.
Excellent, excellent. All right, you too. All the best.
Bye.